Well, good morning. I'm Tom Hopcroft, President and CEO of Mass TLC. I'd like to welcome you to our series on mental health in tech. As we know, for technology companies, our people are our most important assets, and mental health is a concern even in the best of times. But today, with the rise of COVID and the social justice movement in full swing, there's increased pressure and often reduced support opportunities for mental health. Given the importance of the issues, Mass TLC teamed with MindWise Innovations to put together this four-part series on mental health in technology. As we get started, I'd like to thank our global sponsors. These companies provide their time and their treasure to supporting the activities of the organization throughout the year, and their thought leadership is invaluable as we put together programs like this one today. Now, in today's session, we're going to be talking about how anxiety and depression impact tech teams. I'd also like to invite you to join us. This is part of a four-part series, and I invite you to join us through the sessions over the next couple of weeks. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Aaron Lurch from MindWise to review some of the housekeeping items and get into the conversation with our guests, Lisa Desai and Andrew Shatte. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Lurch. I am part of the MindWise Innovations team. MindWise provides a suite of digital solutions and consultative services that allow corporations, states, and universities to understand the unique behavioral health needs of their organization. MindWise is powered by Riverside Community Care, a nonprofit leader in behavioral health and human services. Today's webinar, as Tom said, is the second in a four-part series on behavioral health in tech companies. Mass Technology Leadership Council and MindWise have come together to provide this series to help tech executives better navigate the psychological safety and anti-stigma requirements of today's workplace. Before we get started, I wanted to go through a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be about 60 minutes long. We have some time set aside at the end of the webinar for a Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar via the Q&A function, which is located on the bottom of your Zoom window. We may answer some as we go, but we'll save others for our presenters to answer at the end. Please note that your submitted questions may be seen by other attendees with your name attached. If you would prefer to ask your question anonymously, that option is available in the Q&A box. Your audio and video have been automatically disabled for this webinar, so there's no need to worry about being heard or seen during the presentation. After the webinar is over, we will be emailing out a link to view the recording to everyone who registered for today's webinar. Please feel free to share that link with others who might be interested. The email will also include a copy of the slides from today's presentation. And now, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our presenters for today, starting with Lisa Desai. Lisa is the Director of Behavioral Health Consulting here at MindWise. She leads the development of new screening tools and innovative programs with the goal of reaching underserved populations. She's been a practicing licensed psychologist for 25 years, providing behavioral health services to youth, adults, and families. Also joining us today is Dr. Andrew Shatte, who is the co-founder and chief knowledge officer of meQuilibrium. A Ph.D. psychologist, Dr. Shatte has devoted his 25-year career to understanding the psychological aspects of motivation and resilience, and to developing programs to optimize human performance in various areas such as the workplace, health, academics, and sports. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Shatte.
Aaron, thank you so much. Lisa, it's so great to be presenting with you today. It really is a great honor. I want to thank MindWise and Mass TLC for making this all happen. Lisa?
Same here, Andrew. And I am just seeing if I can, I guess I will move the deck for you, if that's okay. It looks like.
Yeah, that looks like I did request control, but it looks like you have it. So,
okay. All right. I will try not to abuse apologies for this. Can you all see the screen without the box in between?
Yes, it looks good.
Fine. Okay. All right. Take it away, Andrew. Apologies for the glitch.
Thank you. Actually, Lisa, if we go back to the previous slide, why don't we tell people what we plan to cover today? Because
Absolutely.
This is such an important session for us at meQuilibrium to be involved with. We've been in the resilience and research and skills development area for such a long time. And really great to team with you at MindWise to present this for Mass TLC. And for my part of the webinar today, I really want to talk about resilience, what it is, the kinds of ways that we're seeing the need for resilience in the current environment. As Tom said, a lot has happened over the last few months. The social justice movement for sure, COVID-19, our lives have been turned upside down. And now, resilience, it's an evergreen set of competencies, but there are times in our lives when we need them more than others. And now is one of those times. And then you at MindWise have been doing such wonderful work around mental health for such a long time, and great to be able to tap into your expertise as we go through the webinar today as well, Lisa.
Great.
So maybe we should start with what resilience is, because it's kind of a squishy concept. And when most of us think about it, we think about how we need it, but we don't really know what it is. And if you ask most people, what do you think resilience is? They'll give very good answers, like it's bouncing back from adversity or steering through trouble. And that's all good. But it occurred to us in the mid-90s that was more a description of what resilient people do and what people use their resilience for than a real definition. And so for me, and I have that kind of tech mind that our audience does today, I want to unpack this concept. We started the research of trying to work out exactly what resilience is. And this is the list of the 7 things that keeps coming up again and again for us. So firstly, it's that ability to stay calm under pressure. This has been really put to the test in recent times. Many of us who weren't working remotely now are. The distinction between work and life is blurred more than it ever was before. I don't know how many of us have been on Zoom sessions like this just to see the child fly by in the background. So that ability to stay calm is a really quintessential piece of the resilience puzzle, and it's really getting put to the test. And then the second piece is what we call impulse control, and it's really the ability to control your behaviors. Lisa, I know you're aware of this study, but back in the 1970s, there was a great study done by Walter Mischel at a Stanford University. It became known as the Marshmallow Study. And in that study, Mischel and his colleagues brought in 8-year-old kids and sat them down, and they said, they put a marshmallow on the desk in front of the child. They said, this is your marshmallow. If you want to eat it, that's fine. It'll leave the room. I'll come back in about 5-10 minutes. If the marshmallow is still here, I'll give you a second one. If you've already eaten it, you just get that one. It's a great test of impulse control. They leave, they film. This film is priceless because all of these kids want this marshmallow, but they want the second one too. So they're trying to control their impulse to eat it. A lot of them are poking at it. A lot of them are walking away, coming back. One kid, and this is just fantastic, he looks around the room, no one's looking. He picks it up, licks it, puts it back down. All the researchers do is just note who ate the marshmallow, who did not. 10 years later in this longitudinal study, these kids are now seniors in high school. They measure them on their GPA, SAT scores, and parent, teacher, and peer ratings of their social behaviors. On all 5 of those measures, the kids who could control their impulse at 8 are doing better at 18. So we see these 2 as sort of being like the 1-2 punch of resilience. They're really, really key. Problem solving is really important. There are ways that goes downhill under pressure. Self-confidence, a belief in yourself, optimism, obviously, but it needs to be reality-based. And we've seen that a lot of our optimism is being chiseled away. And then empathy, because it's a really important way for us to connect to others, which keeps us resilient and strong under pressure. And then finally, reaching out, which is the willingness and ability to take on opportunities. And what a lot of people have been talking about recently, and I think it's worth saying, and we'll spend more time on this together, is that, yeah, these are tough times, but in tough times, there's typically an opportunity for growth. And if we look, we saw this with 9/11, Lisa, we saw it with the Great Recession. If we look for that opportunity for growth, we can actually emerge out of all of this stronger than we did before. But I'm wondering, as you look down this list, you must recognize a lot of this in the work that you've done over time as well.
Absolutely. Is this for me, Andrew? I didn't know if that's for the audience. Absolutely.
Yes, it's for you.
You know, I mean, there's so much in what you just said. And I think when I think about empathy particularly, there's a lot now around empathic leadership, that the skills, the kind of hard skills of leadership, that the technology, the training, all of that is key. But the soft skill of empathy is also emerging to the forefront in terms of what really divides a successful, connected leader in these times. So I wonder if that comes up also in your work around resilience and leadership.
It really does. And we've studied a lot of organizations, both in the private sector and the public sector. We've seen them going through great change. You know, some examples might be both, again, in the private sector and in federal government, where they're moving from retail to online. So instead of having bricks and mortar, they're just massive changes or mergers and acquisitions or massive reorgs, transformational changes in their business line. And what we see again and again is the first casualty of those changes is a loss of empathy among leadership. And when we go into the covers for this, what we discover is that leaders, when pushed, will say, hey, look, we're under such pressure right now. I'm just trying to do my own job here. I'm trying to keep my own head above water. And I'd love to be able to connect in with my team more than I do. But right now, it's just extremely difficult. And I think, you know, that COVID-19 has accelerated a lot of things that were already happening in the global workforce. And one of those was remote work. And remote work just makes it a little bit, 1 degree of separation more difficult to find that empathy, to really understand what's going on for our colleagues and particularly as a leader for our team members. So it is the first casualty of war. And this move to remote work, I think, has just made that even more difficult.
Yeah, in the last the session we just did, Andrew, in the poll, one of the top concerns people had in the audience was around balancing work-life balance working remotely. So that's absolutely on target. You had a great poll for us to consider.
Yeah, you know, our work at meQuilibrium has shown that there are 7 big emotions that tend to get in the way of emotion control, which is that sort of first really significant factor of resilience. And I was really interested in finding out among our audience today, which of the 7 big emotions for them they feel like is getting most in the way for them right now. And I'd love them to answer this poll if they would. So which of the 7 big emotions is most getting in the way of your resilience right now? Is it anxiety, anger, shame, embarrassment, guilt, sadness, or frustration? And if we give people just a moment to answer that, and as they're doing that, just to reinforce that over the last 30 years working in this space, we've been able to see that emotion control is one of the super factors of resilience, sort of one of the first among equals. If you don't have that ability to stay calm and focused in place, it's difficult for any of the other ingredients of resilience to be there. And these are the big 7 that we've documented really get in the way for people most. So I'm wondering if I think we've given people enough time. So perhaps if we can move to the results.
Erin, any?
There we go. Interesting. So I've got to say, this is very much in accord with other research that we've done at meQuilibrium. The numbers are almost exactly the same. In fact, in the meQuilibrium polls that we did, 52% of people said anxiety and 28% said frustration. So it's very much in line. We're seeing a little, you know, anxiety is an emotion, Lisa, that comes up when we're really thinking about future threat, what's going to happen to us down the track. So it makes a lot of sense that during this great uncertainty, we're seeing a lot of anxiety because people are really speculating into the future. And as we'll talk about in a moment, some of that speculation isn't accurate. And frustration.
Absolutely.
Frustration is, go ahead, please.
Sorry, and anxiety is so connected to a sense of wanting control in our lives. And right now, as you mentioned earlier, everything's turned upside down in COVID. So from a kind of population-based way, we are really facing a lack of control. So it makes sense that it's heightened.
We are. And we're watching big events rob us of that control. I can't single-handedly flatten the curve. I can't dictate what the economy is going to look like in 6, 12, 18 months because of this pandemic. So it is taking away control, and that is going to bring up anxiety. Also, just wanted to talk about some of the other things that we saw there. Frustration. 31% of people in that poll talked about frustration. Now, we know that frustration is an emotion that comes up when we believe that we don't have the resources we need to get something done. And this is what we're hearing from our clients, Lisa, at meQuilibrium, that a lot of people just feel like they're not doing anything well right now. I'm not parenting well. I'm not a good partner. I'm not a good team member. And that's going to lead to a lot of frustration. And we also saw a little bit of sadness, which I think is interesting. Sadness comes up when we're focusing on loss. And I think there are a lot of us who are thinking, I'm not sure the world, or at least my world, is ever going to be the same again. And that produces that sadness that comes up.
Yep.
So that's really, really interesting. And I think maybe we can move to the next slide.
Yep.
One of the things that you and I were talking about, Lisa, in our lead-up conversations around this was how interesting guilt, shame, embarrassment, these sort of neglected emotions, particularly in our culture, are. And you had some really interesting insights on that as well.
Well, but the piece around shame has always interested me because shame is so silencing. And I think I hear a lot of people say now around the workplace and juggling this home-life balance, work-family balance, that it feels like I'm not doing anything well. It feels like I'm just kind of doing just enough. And so I wonder about the shame, the silencing, and what you see around that, and how you would also differentiate guilt from shame.
Great questions. And, the great Greeks, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they wrote and spoke a lot about this, but we tend to forget those lessons from 2,500 years ago or so. But guilt and embarrassment are always very social emotions. There has to be at least two people involved for us to feel those emotions. When it comes to guilt, it stems from the thought that we violated the rights of another. That's what's going to lead to guilt. And some of us, we develop what we call an emotion radar. In our families of origin as kids, we've learned a way to scan our environment, and some are scanning for how they may be stepping on others' toes. So they get a lot of guilt. Embarrassment comes about when we have a sense that we've lost standing in front of other people, that somehow we've we've goofed or we've dropped the ball, and that people are thinking less of us now than they did before. And that means there has to be an audience. But with shame, it's internal. It really is our thoughts that we're not living up to our own standards of how we should be in the world. And certainly, as many of us were sort of thrust into this position where we're working from home, in the last couple of months, educating our kids, or attempting to, from home. For those of us who have school-age kids, I do. I have an 8-year-old and a 14-year-old. Realizing that I'm kind of dropping the ball on their education while I'm trying to do my job, and really feeling like I'm not being there for my wife, not being supportive enough as she's trying to get everything done. And so the consequence is I feel like I'm just not living up to my own standards. Now, the problem here is we've seen an epidemic of shame way before COVID-19. We saw an epidemic of shame coming up because we're just getting pulled from pillar to post. So many demands on us, so much connectivity to the job. And also, Lisa, we live in a generation now where it's not our parents' generation. My wife and I often talk about the fact that when we were kids, we did whatever our parents did on the weekend. Now we do whatever our kids do on the weekends. And my wife and I bemoan the fact that we never really got our turn. So, for many of us, we're just not living up to these standards. But the problem is that many of these standards are just not attainable. It's almost as if we're wearing a cape with an S on it, and we're just not able to live up to this stuff.
Absolutely. It's the shifting cultural family, which there's so much there we could talk about.
Yes.
Also,
Yes.
talking about culture, just kind of wondering about how you think about and what your research shows around resilience and how it's culture bound. In thinking about the impulse study, the marshmallow study, I know some of those studies have indicated that socioeconomic class plays a big role in terms of kids that can have that impulse control and a sense of if I wait now, I'll get something later. So curious about what your research kind of has shown around that.
Well, you know, Angela Duckworth has done an enormous amount of research out of my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, on grit, and grit and resilience are closely aligned. I think the work on grit really drills into this idea of impulse control, and teaching our kids to be able to delay their gratification is a really critical part of the resilience puzzle, for sure. So for my kids, as an example, if my son is working on math homework and then he says, I need to take a break, I'll say to him, I tell you what, take a break now and you can play on your own. Take a break in 10 minutes and I'll play with you. And that just encourages him to stay in a little bit longer. Now, the way that this translates into the workplace is around focus. And we know that when there's a lot of uncertainty, we tend to lose focus. And so we need to be aware of that, and need to be aware of the fact that mentally we're going to drift because we're not able to control that impulse to allow our mind to drift away. And we have a really concrete set of skills that can help with that. And a lot of these emotions are, if not culture bound, then culture sensitive. You know, I had the great privilege of living and working in Japan for 3 years. And they're much more of a shame culture than we are in the West. And so I saw shame there in ways that I didn't before. But as I mentioned, I think we're seeing shame on the increase here. People are becoming more aware of it. And the problem is that, as I said, we may be setting standards that nobody can achieve. And that means we're experiencing a lot of shame, maybe guilt, maybe embarrassment, that's not warranted. And that's where our emotion control starts to get shaken. That's the basic building block of resilience. And then the walls start tumbling.
Yeah, fantastic. So much of this we can talk about for so long. Love to hear your thoughts about self-care.
Yeah, you know, self-care. This is one of the things that I didn't really think about that much as a resilience researcher until I started working and co-founding meQuilibrium, because then we were looking at a wider spectrum than just productivity and performance. We're looking at emotional health, mental well-being. And I began to realize just how critical self-care is. You know, if you are below the mean on sleep quality, then you only have around about a 12% chance of being above the mean on resilience. So sleep is absolutely critical. We know that taking care of diet and nutrition is critical. We know that exercise is critical. And you know what? Just like COVID-19 wasn't a big enough problem, when it pushed us to remote work, when it closed our gyms, when it made things difficult, when it made the fridge incredibly accessible in ways that it wasn't before, then self-care dropped off, and we have not seen it restored. So it's one of the casualties of COVID-19 for sure. Is that in accord with what you guys have seen as well, MindWise?
Yeah, and I think that in addition to individuals, when we take care of ourselves and take care of our teams, there's a tremendous benefit. I know, you know, sometimes we use our MindWise team as kind of an example of what we try to do. So I think a lot of checking in with one another. So it's taking care of ourselves, and by doing that, by modeling that, you're also encouraging team members to take care of themselves, just as we do our family members, hopefully.
Exactly so.
I agree with you. Self-care is the challenge.
So why don't we go to the next poll, because I think we might get some insight here. Because right now, you know, we've done some research, but I'd love to see what's happening with this audience. So compared to a year ago, how would you compare your level of self-care? Is it much better, the same, worse, or much worse? And, you know, I hope this audience is unique. I hope that they're really taking care of themselves, but that isn't what we've been seeing universally. It's probably a pretty quick poll, this one, so why don't we take a look and see what we have.
Oh.
Okay, so no one much better, It looks like it's a little more even than what we've seen generally. It's basically, 31% on the bad side of things versus 23% on the good side of things, with most of us at the same. And so I'm very encouraged by that. I think that Mass TLC should take heart with this, because this shows a level of preservation of self-care that we're not seeing generally. But I think on this topic, it would be really good for people to reflect on what they're doing. I want to talk about some very large-scale beliefs that can tend to get in the way of self-care that are getting activated right now. At meQuilibrium, we call these Iceberg beliefs, largely because they're very foundational beliefs. Big beliefs about ourselves and the world and how we should be in the world, but we're not really aware of them. It's almost like they're submerged. The bulk of these big belief systems are submerged in our unconscious or subconscious. It's like an iceberg. And they tend to come in three basic types. We see that some people have icebergs in the achievement space, and they could be things like, I must get everything done perfectly right. If it's not done perfectly, it's a failure. Striving for excellence is the ultimate cause. These are the kinds of things that we see, and people are acting on these without really being fully aware of them. In the social space, it might be more things like, it's my job to make sure people are happy. I should always be there for the people I love. Sacrificing for others is the right thing to do. And I ask our audience, Lisa, to, as I go through these, ask themselves, does this sound like you? I know that many of mine are stacked up in the social space. It's my job to make sure people are happy, or I should always be there for the people I love are big for me. And then finally, in control. If you want it done right, do it yourself. Good things happen to good people, bad things to bad people. The more control I get, the better my life will be. A lot of people are operating on those. Now, the interesting thing is that big events like this pandemic shake our control, as you were mentioning very astutely earlier, Lisa, that we're in a situation now where our lives are largely being controlled by big external forces that are outside of our locus of control. And for me, I can live with that. What I have more difficulty with is that my aging parents in Australia, I'm unable to visit them during this time, because that's pulling at all my social icebergs. Yeah. The people who are stacked up on control, this is a really, really tough time with them. Now, we saw this with 9/11 as well. There are a lot of people who had the belief good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. That made them feel confident to move around the world safely, because if I'm only a good person, nothing bad will happen to me. And then on 9/11, they became very, very aware that some very, very bad things happened to very good people, and that iceberg was shattered. So during this time, I would encourage people also just to be aware of the kind of icebergs they had that could be making a bad situation worse. Lisa?
Yeah, well, I would say I have three icebergs floating around for myself, all three. But it's interesting. I would agree that for me, the social probably is prominent. And it's interesting you mentioned family. I would say for me, probably culture bound. I'm Indian South Asian, and I think there's a lot of family duty obligation that comes to the forefront. So often that sense of I'm not doing enough, or, so I could completely see where that piece, all three of those pieces could get in the way of feeling, being able to recognize or feel the resilient factors.
Exactly. And what we want to help people do is to get these from being submerged, get them out, take a real good look at them, and evaluate them from an adult perspective, because many of these are formed when we're 10, 11, 12. They're a little naive, and that's why you hear such sort of black and white pronouncements. I should get everything perfectly right, which is unattainable. So they lack that kind of intellectual shades of gray that we know we need to have in the adult world. Yes, I would like to always be there for the people I love, but that's an impossibility. So what is a plan of action that I can put in place that can maximize that desire in me without burning me out. And that's one of the things I think, it's important to address as well. And perhaps the next slide too, because you had some really interesting insights into this as well.
Well, I'm always interested in thinking about as, gender always plays a huge piece, and I'm wondering about how that enters into this, especially as we see women kind of in different roles in the workforce and what that looks like with resilience versus men. So very curious about that.
Yeah, you were talking about the culture in which you were raised and the unique pressures that places on you. And I think that's exactly right. And I think what we've seen, and I'm really borrowing heavily now from other works such as Carol Gilligan, a great sociologist who was out of Harvard, who wrote a brilliant book called In a Different Voice. But if we take a look at that, what we see is that there are pressures, and it's terrible to generalize this way, but just excuse me for a moment while I do, that for women, there are pressures on them to both be successful in the achievement space and be affiliative and social in ways that I don't have that same pressure socially. The example that I always give is that back in the day when we were traveling, if I got on a plane every week and left my family behind to provide for them, I was seen as the best dad ever. But I dare say that if my wife did the same thing, there'd be criticisms of her as a mom. So I do believe that there are differences in how society views our roles. And a lot of these you could consider to be icebergs.
Absolutely. And it's interesting if you flip that from what a lot of what we do at MindWise is looking at high-risk groups and working age men are a high-risk group. And one of the things, what's interesting is societally men are encouraged to be non-affiliative, to not express their feelings, which puts them in a different bind when there are struggles and when there are these icebergs that emerge. So it's fascinating how both genders struggle differently.
Yeah, exactly so. And then, of course, most of the puzzle is explained by big individual differences between people based on how they were raised, whether they're men or women. And the key here is to really take a close look. Think about those big moments when there's a real tension in you. Maybe that's because you need to delegate, but there's something in you saying, I don't want to do that. Maybe it's when you feel like you should be at home, but you're at work. And those big moments of tension and stress will give you some insight to a time when you are banging up against this iceberg. And that'll enable you to bring it out, take a look at it, and then really analyze it from a life perspective. Is this working for me? Is this something that I really need to work hard to rid myself of?
It's really helpful to think about it that way, Andrew.
So this flows from that conversation, Lisa, and it's really about the fact that when we at meQuilibrium take a look at how people respond to adversity and attempt to be resilient under change or uncertainty or adversity, we find 5 typical types of responses, and we can really give a person a personality type around this. Some people are problem solvers. They go straight into problem solving mode. Some stay calm. They're the regulators. Some are like, I think this is going to work out really well, and they're the optimists. Others, so the entrepreneurial among us, the adventurers, they're looking for that silver lining, the opportunity in the fog. But many of us are caregivers, and that means that what we want to do is when something strikes like this, we want to take care of everybody around us. Now that's wonderful. And I wonder how many people in our audience are saying, yeah, that's kind of me. Maybe as a leader in my organization, maybe as a parent, maybe as a partner, maybe as a friend. I tend to sacrifice my own interests for others. Excuse me. And I'm often reminded of, back in the day when we flew, a flight attendant saying, make sure to secure the oxygen mask on yourself before you attempt it on somebody else. And that's a lesson to learn, because we know that caregiver personality is a big risk for burnout. And what we're seeing is, as we're going through this uncertainty, we're getting that kind of uncertainty fatigue, particularly among our caregivers. And when you consider that work and life now is incredibly blurred in ways even greater than it was before, for the caregiver, this is a big recipe for disaster, because we're trying to work. Some of us are working out of our bedrooms. The number of times that I've had people say, I'm in my bedroom right now, but at 10 a.m., I need to go to, the kids' bedroom because they'll be emerging. So, and so we're really torn and we're trying to take care of all of these things at once. So I would beseech our audience to say, am I a caregiver? Does that load me up with icebergs like I should be sacrificing for others? That's putting me at risk during this time of burnout. And what can I do, again, to the self-care issue, to take a little care of myself? Am I getting the right sleep? Am I eating well? Am I trying to exercise under these circumstances, Lisa?
Great. So that's a great lead into kind of the intersection between resilience and mental health. So if we take a step back to look at what is mental health generally, it's really important. We always begin with this when we talk about mental health is it's on a continuum. It is not, mental health doesn't mean you have a problem. There are mental health illnesses at one end of the continuum. And at the other end, maybe those very rare unicorns that are always mentally healthy all the time. Most of us are in the middle somewhere. And as you can see, when you think about what are the contributors to mental health, resilience is a strong piece of that. So a strong piece of what gives us a sense of feeling good. So the World Health Organization notes that mental health isn't simply the absence of mental illness. It's also having life satisfaction, relationships that make us feel good, really enhancing relationships, a sense of flexibility. And the flexibility piece is interesting because, Andrew, you mentioned Grit, the book Grit, and flexibility also in terms of what Carol Dweck talks about in mindset is that cognitive flexibility. And I think also there needs to be a relational flexibility, if you will. So particularly with teams these days, we're seeing that leadership has to have not only a kind of that cognitive flexibility to kind of shift sets, if you will, but also relationally to change the plan, to think about this isn't working, this person can't be on this call, what do we do differently? So that brings mental health to oneself, but also the team, if you will, and a sense of purpose. I mean, this is something we could talk days about, Andrew, because
Yes.
psychology, what meaning is to us in our lives as individuals. And there's a lot now written about purpose in the workplace,
Yes.
the importance of why, and identify why are we doing what we're doing. That's the first kind of piece we need to look at. So just kind of touching upon what really goes into mental health. Andrew, any thoughts about this?
I think this is a fabulous list. And what I love about what you've just shown up here, Lisa, is it really is in embracing that positive psychology piece. I could not agree more that the absence of mental illness is not the same as mental health. And we need to be cultivating all these things. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Sure. And what does impact our mental health? So we know environment is a huge piece. Relationships, huge piece, heredity, situations. So there's a lot that goes into our mental health. We know that right now we're all exposed, as Andrew's alluded to and talked about directly, COVID-19, the social injustice that Tom mentioned, the racial injustice that's happening in our country. All of this is impacting us in different ways. So strong intersection between genetic vulnerability, that is part of what we inherit, our relationships. There's been a lot historically written about developmental relationships, the parent-child, and then I think about 20 years ago, the focus really also became on sibling relationships, the key ways in which sibling relationships are central to our lives, maybe even surpassing in the long run the parent-child relationship, some would say. And then the Stone Center at Wellesley College, where I worked many moon ago, really talks about adult relationships and mutuality. And how even small key moments and a couple of key relationships in our adult lives can really transform how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about life, how we interact with individuals in our personal life, our family, but also in the workplace. So a lot to pay attention to in terms of what does impact us. And it reminds me very much, Andrew, what you're saying about also being aware of what resilient type are we, so to speak, and how does that come into play?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the risk of turning this into a mutual admiration society, I think that this slide and the previous one just shows how on the ball MindWise is. I really think that this has got the landscape mapped out.
So what happens when people are struggling? So we just saw that audience members have noted that anxiety is getting in the way the most. If we think about what's currently getting in the way, we know that recent research suggests that a quarter of individuals would say their mental health is mildly to moderately impacted in a negative way, and anxiety has increased during the time of COVID. So we know this is very real. One of the questions we always get asked when we talk about this is, how do I know if it's anxiety that's kind of commonplace, I would almost say these days, versus an anxiety that is an anxiety disorder, anxiety that's really getting in the way? And I would say with any of these, if you look at the symptoms of anxiety, of depression, specifically, we stick with those two for a minute. How bad is it? And in terms of spiking, how acute is it? And how chronic is it? I think that's really important to think about. In a few minutes, I'll talk about what can we do about that to support one another in relationships and also in the workplace. And then burnout. Burnout is important to note because the World Health Organization a year ago did acknowledge burnout as being an occupational hazard and actually listed it as an occupational disorder. And I think that's key because it's starting to show that what we're experiencing, our feelings, our emotional states, our psychological states in the workplace are real. It's not something we can wish away. It's not something we can kind of put in a corner. Andrew, anything to add? Again, I know there's so much to talk about with all of these topics.
You know, there really is. We could have a webinar on each and every one of these slides, but I know what's coming, and I want
okay.
to see what else you have to say.
Okay, so this is a poll. If anyone attended the last webinar, we'll be doing this type of poll because we want to get a sense for many of you, those that are attending for the first time, what do you think is really most impacted and what you think? I actually cannot read this because I've got this box in the way. So what do you think is most helpful to employee well-being during COVID-19? Providing information, more information about what mental health resources are available, an open-minded, psychologically safe workplace, or more flexibility to balance work-home responsibilities. So very curious about what people's thoughts are here. So Erin, whenever you feel that we have the responses, we'll take a look at the poll. Oh, okay. So this is fascinating to me because what I find particularly interesting is that perhaps people feel that they know what the mental health resources are, and that's great. Really, really important to see that people are recognizing the importance and a key role of a psychologically safe workplace. And we'll touch upon that. That's very much the topic of our fourth webinar, but we'll definitely be touching upon that. And then in the flexibility, which is no surprise, Andrew, given what we've already heard from the audience today.
Yeah, not at all. And certainly the psychologically safe workplace. You know, we know that there is going to be a low ceiling on resilience if we don't have transparency, integrity of system, open communication within the system, that even the most resilient person can't function under those circumstances.
That's right, and transparency is such a key word. I don't know if you heard Dan Tater last week, Andrew, talking about leadership during COVID, and one of the prime factors he talked about was what he's learned is the importance of meaningful leadership and transparency in leadership, really having open door policy to communication. So we know that a psychologically safe workplace is one that promotes trust, open communication, feedback, growth opportunities for an individual as well as to contribute to the team's growth, and really giving support to one another. And most importantly in these times, having that trust and an atmosphere that if one is struggling, if they really feel like, I don't know what's going on, but I'm in trouble, I'm worried about my son, my daughter, my spouse, myself, my team member, they can go to their supervisor, they can go to their team member or boss and talk about it. So that really these days is a key benefit of a psychologically safe workplace. So if we think about what's gotten in the way of mental health being addressed in the workplace, sometimes it feels like the stigma word is used often, and it's very real. The stigma around, I can't talk about this, it's not okay. I could talk about my broken leg, I could
Yes.
talk about a lot of things going on with me physically. I can't sleep at night, I can talk about that, but I can't talk about the fact that I'm feeling depressed, or I think I had a panic attack yesterday. So the problem, if you will, is not that people are experiencing those issues. The problem is it's not been okay to talk about in the workplace. And if we look at the recent amazing report put out by the American Heart Association CEO Roundtable survey, 42% of employees would like their employers to provide more information, more resources. And 60% in another study said they would actually like their employer to ask about their mental well-being. So when we really think about that, it's important to look at what really is normative and helpful in the workplace around mental health and what's getting in the way. So related to this, Andrew, you and I talked a bit, and any of these questions that you feel like something that you're thinking about now, be happy to talk about.
Yeah, I think that what we're seeing too is that EAP utilization has been low historically, running somewhere between 3 to 5% of employees accessing it. And we know that mental health problems go well beyond that proportion. So there definitely is a stigma out there. And I think there are a lot of forces these days working against that. At meQuilibrium, we hold roundtable discussions too, with global heads of HR and executives of health and well-being in global organizations. And what we're seeing is that they are gratified to see that their C-suites are recognizing that people are whole people and they come to work as whole people. And I think that COVID-19 has been an accelerant for a lot of forces. It's accelerated remote work, and it's accelerated, even at the highest levels, the recognition of the importance of these issues.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you mentioned that the C-suite piece, Andrew, because it has to come from both. It has to come from the grassroots aspect, but also from leadership. And what we found, and we're kind of we've got about 10 minutes, but I'd like to talk a little bit about some work that we did as a case study, and leadership buy-in from the beginning, but also to maintain engagement throughout. Any kind of cultural shift is key. One of the pieces just around, what needs to change or what's been getting in the way of talking about mental health, I think, is this fear that being quiet about it, not talking about it in itself, is some type of solution historically in the workplace. And again, what we're finding is it's just squash things down rather than creating any kind of solution. The other piece is a concern that, well, if we start talking about this, we're opening a can of worms, and then what happens? And that's a real question. That's a very fair question for HR folks, for leadership. It's really important to think about, what are we putting in place as a response if we start having these conversations? So one of the pieces that we do, and in line with what you're talking about, Andrew, with your roundtable, and really encouraging conversations through leadership, at MindWise, one approach we've taken is putting together a behavioral health literacy program, which is a module. It's about a 45, 60-minute module that is really about having entry-level conversations, if you will, about what does mental health look like, in an interactive way, having conversations about what does it look like when it shows up, what gets in the way of our talking about it, what are ways we can start having these conversations, and very much with the idea that this isn't a one and done situation. If we're starting to have these conversations, we need to continue to have the conversations. We did a series of focus groups about a year ago, and a strong trend is that people aren't sure how to have these conversations. And so just to kind of move into the case study, so we have time for questions at the end. What we did with the behavioral health literacy with a certain organization, that very large kind of international presence, is we started with the staff, and we did a town hall where we talked about, we're kicking off this initiative. But the initiative, again, is not a one and done initiative. It is the beginning of change. It's the beginning of really thinking about how behavioral health impacts us. What was fantastic was the turnout for the town halls as well as the behavioral health literacy. It was completely voluntary. There was no incentive. And still people really showed up, and not only did they show up, but they engaged in the conversation. I would say a key piece to this, to your point, Andrew, is that we had leadership from business units, from HR, from health and safety. And given that this happened, we did this in the last 3 months, we also had leadership from diversity and inclusion join the conversations, because we really felt like if we're going to talk about behavioral health in these times, we have to be very real about what's going on right now and how it's impacting us. So just kind of a way of how to think systemically about addressing behavioral health. So this is a piece around various ways in which it's important to think about behavioral health. I'll move to the takeaways because I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to, Andrew, hand it over to you here to kind of review the takeaways, and then we can open up to questions.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we can think of resilience as being a concrete thing. And I know that for those of us who have a tech mind, that's what we want. And for me, I'm that way. It really is these 7 basic ingredients. And we know that there are a lot of thinking styles that we develop over time, including iceberg beliefs that can get in the way of each of these 7 competencies. And iceberg beliefs really do get in the way of self-care. As you've pointed out, Lisa, you know, resilience is one aspect of mental health. There are other pieces to the puzzle, but certainly people with low resilience are at greater risk. And really important for us to be part of that cultural shift that brings mental health awareness to the forefront. I think really good information that we got from our audience today on all aspects of these takeaways. So questions?
Yes.
Excuse me. Yeah, so we do have a couple of questions. Let's start with the more general one, and then we can go on to the more specific one. The more general question is, what else can a company's leadership do to facilitate mental health help-seeking behavior among its employees?
I've seen both these questions, and I think this one is way better suited for Lisa and maybe the more specific one to me. So I'm going to hand this over to Lisa.
Oh, okay, sure. So, you know, I think one, for leadership to be informed about what's happening within their organization, be informed about behavioral health issues, how they show up, how they impact the workforce, how they impact productivity, concentration, teamwork, getting in the way of teams really effectively working together. But it very much has to be communicating this message throughout the organization. So I think leadership taking a team approach, as I said, across different functions within an organization to convey this message, and then making sure that their resources are in place and those resources work smoothly. You know, one of the top concerns that we hear from employees of organizations, if they are hesitant to reach out, is they're not sure that when they reach out, they're going to be met with an effective service, or they're not sure that it's going to be a smooth process. So for leadership, it's a little bit of the high level, taking that high level view of how is this all going to look? How can I remain visible in this conversation? So again, not in the beginning saying, here, we're kicking off this initiative, here's our new top flight EAP, which is phenomenal, and then taking a back seat. It's periodically being visible, whether it's through emails, whether it's through a video clip, whether it's through a town hall, really having that visibility. And then from an operational standpoint, ensuring that when people do reach out, that there is there's a very clear, effective process in place.
Great. And for the more specific question, we had an employee that we made accommodations to address someone's anxiety diagnosis and saw backlash and attrition from peers who feel that the accommodations were unfair. How can we communicate with the organization while respecting employee privacy?
You know, it's a great question. And I think it gets at the heart of the fact that we do not see a mental condition as being on the same level as a physical condition. And I'm sure that if we substituted that out with, instead of anxiety disorder, it was perhaps a serious physical illness, we wouldn't have seen the same backlash. We do cut people way more slack for that than we do mental health. So I think, again, it's an information issue. I think that leadership needs to step in at that point, encourage empathy. I do believe also in equity and fairness. So obviously there has to be limits to accommodations that are made to an employee so that everyone feels good about what's happening. But I think a lot of it is information, and I think a lot of it is empathy. And I also think that in these situations, transparency, open communication, as we said before, not everyone needs to be treated the same, but people need to be treated fairly. And so, yeah, this is a tricky one. But I would encourage those people from whom you saw backlash to sub out anxiety disorder and put in, say, chronic back pain or a cancer diagnosis or something else that they could more relate to. And I think they'd be more willing to cut slack. So again, I think it's an attitude shift that's required.
Yeah, that's a great point. If there are any final questions, folks, please go ahead and submit them now. I do have, actually, I have a question based on what you guys were talking about. Lisa, I was really struck by the data that 60% of workers would like their companies to ask them about their mental health. And I'm curious about the 40% who didn't want that, and how we can walk the line of making sure people know it's okay to talk about it without forcing folks who don't feel comfortable, and whether that might make them feel unsafe if they feel too under pressure.
Erin, that's a fantastic question. I'll take a stab at this, and then Andrew, happy to hear your thoughts as well. I think that in general, when we're saying let's have a conversation about this, it's important to say we're opening the door to the conversation. There should be no pressure to have this conversation. Even when we have our behavioral health literacy programs, we're very clear that this is something that for some people will always remain very private, or they may just feel uncomfortable talking about it, and that is okay. But it's also important, just as we do with physical health, to Andrew's point, and other pieces that we talk about. When we talk about in the DI space, diversity in every kind of way. When we are saying it's okay to talk about this openly, it's important to acknowledge that mental health needs to be part of that, with an understanding that we talk about respectfully, and Erin, as you said, in a safe way, and also being very respectful of people that decline being part of the conversation. I think as long as there is safe, respectful behavior, it is completely okay to not be part of that conversation. It's when there is behavior that crosses a line and creates a uncomfortable atmosphere or an uncomfortable situation between people where things need to be addressed.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
I have nothing to add, and I am aware that we are at the top of the hour. So on behalf of meQuilibrium and myself, I really want to thank MindWise and MassTLC for hosting this and for having us represented here today, and really like to thank Lisa for her generosity of spirit in bringing us on board here as well.
Oh, Andrew, it was an absolute delight to have you join us, and I think we'll have many other conversations because lots to learn from you. So this was really wonderful. Thank you for joining us. Amazing work that you do, meQuilibrium, and thank you everyone for being here today.
Yeah, I'll jump in and thank both of you for your expertise and the great conversation today. And that, I guess, will wrap us up. Thank you to our attendees as well for coming. And if you are interested, we do have 2 more webinars coming up next week and the week after at the same time. So check out MassTLC's website to find out more.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.